My name is Mave Harper, I'm 29 years old, and I'm currently the program director at a nonprofit educational organization in Boston. That night, I was just trying to do something kind. Stopping in the middle of a snowstorm to hand a lunch and the only scarf I owned to an elderly homeless man who was trembling on a bench. What I didn't know was, just 30 minutes later when I walked into the dining room of the Elliott family estate, the place where I was supposed to meet my future father-in-law for the first time, that man would be sitting at the head of the table. Arthur Elliott, the reclusive billionaire who controlled the fate of a multi-billion-dollar empire, and of the marriage I thought I was ready to step into. What would you do if you realized the person you helped without thinking was the one silently evaluating you? Leave a comment, hit like, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next part. Because right after this, I'll tell you how a sandwich and a single scarf changed the course of my life and the destiny of an entire empire. I met Asher Elliott at a social tech innovation summit for young changemakers held on Harvard's campus last spring. I was a guest speaker presenting a model for sustainable education in border regions. He, the heir to the Elliott Financial Group, was sitting in the front row. White shirt, hair slightly messy, like he had just taken off his headphones and walked in right before it started. I remember that first look, not the kind that sweeps you off your feet like in a romance movie, but the kind that makes you pause because it feels like the other person is already evaluating you. But when I talked about kids using refurbished phones to learn math, Asher didn't look at his phone, didn't whisper to anyone, he actually listened. We started with a few conversations during breaks, and gradually became two people grabbing coffee at 6:30 in the morning because we were both too busy to meet at night. He once told me I was a rare moment of calm in a world that moves too fast for him. I was never the kind of woman who fit in the framed family photos they hung in their homes. I grew up in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, daughter of a single mom who worked part-time at a library and gave piano lessons in the evenings. No private school, no ski trips to Aspen, no horseback riding summer camps. I got through school on scholarships. Worked at a gas station for the first 3 years of college, and once wore a thrifted dress to an interview because I couldn't afford a new one. But Asher was drawn to all of that. He said I didn't pretend, that I wasn't trying to be someone else, the way he always felt everyone around him was. "You're real," he once said late one night in Cambridge while we sat at a wooden table in the tiny apartment I rented. "At home, everything is staged, from what people say to even how they smile." Still, stepping into his family felt like walking onto a reality show I never signed up for. From the very first meeting with his mother, Celeste Elliott, I knew I wasn't welcome. She opened our conversation by asking, "What state school did you graduate from again?" And without waiting for an answer continued on about investment prospects of Ivy League endowments. Asher's older brother Nathan was the picture-perfect Elliott dream. Investments, yachts, political connections. He once asked me, half-joking, "So, if you marry Asher, are you quitting that nonprofit gig? I mean, you could actually do something valuable." Asher always stood in the middle. He never openly defended me, but he didn't leave me hanging either. We argued about that once. After a particularly pointed dinner with his family, I asked, "Do you see how they're looking down on me?" He stayed quiet for a long time before finally saying, "I do. I don't know how to make them stop without making things worse." I understood, and I didn't blame him, but those small cuts, from comments, looks, selective silences, gradually created a distance, not between me and Asher, but between me and the world he came from. The Elliott family never says anything directly. They won't tell you you're not good enough. They'll send a dinner invitation without letting you know it's actually a silent evaluation. They'll buy you a silk dress in the exact color of his grandmother's favorite, but it's also a test to see if you know your place in the bigger picture. I wasn't naive. I knew what I looked like in their eyes. A morally decent girl but from the wrong background. An outsider they might tolerate, if I kept quiet enough. But Asher was different. At least, I still believed that when he held my hand that morning before the dinner. His hand was cold and trembling. He didn't kiss me like he usually did, gripped my hand tightly and said, "This isn't a normal family dinner, Mave. This is a test, and my father is the one writing the questions. New tests like that are never fair." But I Still wore the dress he picked, wrapped the scarf he suggested, because I loved him, and I thought if I couldn't win at their game, I could at least walk into it without losing myself. What I didn't expect was that the person who had actually set the test was the same man I had stopped for that snowy morning to give him a cold sandwich and the only scarf I owned. I received the invitation to the Elliott family dinner by email, but it wasn't sent by Asher or even a member of his family. It was a formal document from Arthur Elliott's private legal office, with the title straight from a law manual. Notice of required attendance at family dinner, December 14th, at 5 p.m. Location, Arthur Elliott's private residence, Fairchild Estate, Vermont. And we were still on a drop serve until the fire. No greeting, no personal note, not even a please. Attendance is mandatory, no proxies allowed. I reread the message 3 times, thinking maybe I was overreacting, but when I forwarded it to Asher, he wasn't surprised. Typical of him, he muttered, eyes still on his laptop screen but his hands curling into fists. He doesn't invite, he summons. Asher, I don't understand, is this a family dinner or a hearing? He didn't laugh, just shook his head slightly. To my father, every dinner is a trial. Asher Elliott is the kind of person who rarely loses his composure. He once negotiated funding for a startup during a scandal where the CEO was accused of misconduct, and debated international foundation leaders about the role of tech in global education. But that night, the man I loved sat silently on the couch, fingers interlaced, back straight, without support, like he was waiting for a verdict. "You're not the first person I brought home," he said after several minutes of silence. His voice raspy, like he'd been weighing this for a long time. "A few years ago, I was in love with Claire. We were together for 2 years. She was an architectural designer in Portland. My mom tolerated her, but my dad didn't. I'd heard him mention that name once during a light evening with wine, but he'd never given details. Hamilton didn't object directly," Asher went on. "He invited her to dinner, like this one. 3 days later, Claire got a job offer in Dubai, from an architecture firm no one had ever heard of before. It came with enough money to clear all her student debt and buy an apartment. The condition was she had to leave that week." "You think your dad was behind it?" Asher didn't answer, his eyes said everything. "And she left? No goodbye, no explanation, just a 3-sentence email." Something sank in my chest, not jealousy, something colder. Insecurity. "I'm not Claire," I said softly but clearly. "I know," Asher replied. "That's exactly why I'm scared." He wasn't trembling from the cold. He was trembling from a feeling I knew all too well. The fear of losing the one thing that still made you feel like yourself. Then he handed me a piece of paper. On it was a short bulleted list, written in his neat handwriting. "Don't mention your job. We avoid talking about your family, especially your mother. Don't call my father Mr. Elliott, just say sir. If politics come up, deflect. If pushed, say you support stability. Don't show too much emotion, my family hates drama. Keep it short, no life stories." I read down to the last line and stopped. "Never be late." I looked up and asked softly, "Do you hear yourself right now? I know, it sounds awful, but you don't understand. My father isn't like anyone you've ever met. He doesn't play chess. He is the board." I held the paper in my hand, staring at it like a map I had to navigate just to enter a world I was never meant to belong to. And strangely, I didn't feel offended. I just felt distant, like a part of me had stepped outside the room and was watching from afar. A woman sitting on a sofa trying to reshape herself into a more digestible version for a family that had no intention of swallowing her. I folded the paper and slipped it into my coat pocket. Then I asked, half joking, "So, am I allowed to say I like cats, or does your family only do dogs?" Asher gave a faint laugh, so light it barely registered as a sound. But I knew nothing about that night was light. Every word, every step, every moment I spent in that mansion would be part of a test I never volunteered for. And the one writing the exam? Arthur Elliott had yet to show his face. I left the park in a hurry, cold wind slicing across my face, cheeks burning with anxiety. I knew I was late. Not the kind of late you apologize for politely. This was the kind of late that could derail your entire life. The cashmere scarf, the only thing in my outfit that might have been acceptable to the Elliott family, was now resting on the shoulders of the homeless man I'd helped. He had smiled and thanked me in a voice rough and deep, carried by the wind, and I'd nodded quickly, not thinking of anything else except getting there before the clock hit 5:30. As the massive black iron gates with golden E initials slowly opened, I could barely breathe. The mansion ahead rose from the ground like a relic, grand, ancient, cold, and so perfect it felt soulless. I ran nearly the entire final stretch, shoes sinking into the soft earth along the edge of the lawn. Asher was already there, standing on the granite steps, hands in his coat pockets, back straight like a statue, phone glowing in his palm. When he saw me, his eyes shifted from worry to anger in a single breath. He came down 2 steps and pulled me aside, out of view from the staff. "Mave, where have you been?" His voice was low, not shouting, but cold enough to sting my throat. "Do you even know what time it is? You're 17 minutes late." I didn't have a chance to answer before he whispered again, fast and tight like trying to suppress panic. "My father hates lateness, I told you that. You don't get it, he sees it as a sign of instability, of someone who can't be trusted. You showing up like this, it ruins everything." I was gasping for air from the cold and the running, unsure where to even begin. The porch lights cast long shadows of us down the steps, distorted and distant, like strangers. "I saw a man on the way," I said quietly. "He had nothing to eat, he was freezing, his lips were blue. I gave him my sandwich and my scarf." Asher froze. 1 second. 2 seconds. Then he looked at me like I'd just confessed to losing the family's heirloom ring. "What scarf?" he asked, voice dry. "The one you gave me this morning, gray cashmere." He stared at me without blinking, then closed his eyes tightly, hands pressing into his temples. "That scarf, that was Burberry, $700. I didn't give it to you because it was expensive. I gave it to you because my mother likes that style. I planned every detail." "I know, but he was shaking from the cold and "You think kindness is going to make him forgive you for being late?" He cut me off, not shouting, but every word hit like a blade. "You think this is some moral lesson at a bus stop, Mave? This is my home, my family, my father. And he doesn't care about kindness, he only cares about order." I knew every explanation, every good intention, would be crushed beneath the weight of a father Asher never really understood. "Asher," I said gently, "I didn't do it to ruin anything." I couldn't walk away from someone who was cold and hungry. Even one meal, one scarf, it might have made a difference. "And in return," he said, letting go of my hand, "you're late, you look a mess, you're missing everything I told you to wear. What do you think he'll assume, that you missed your train?" I wasn't sure if I was shivering from the cold or from the realization forming in my mind. He wasn't worried for me. He hadn't been worried about me for all those 17 minutes. The only thing that upset him was what his father would think. The same father who never called on his birthday, who once replied to his graduation announcement with a single sentence, "Good work, carry on." I looked at Asher. The man who once gently touched my shoulder when I cried over a student dropping out was now so afraid he'd cut me off entirely, just because I no longer matched the approved version. He didn't say I was a burden, but his eyes, full of despair, disappointment, and fear, said it for him. I bit my lip, not to hold back tears, but to stop myself from saying something I couldn't take back. As if I'm not perfect? I'm not enough to stand beside you? The double ebony doors opened with a near-silent push, the hinges groaning softly like a breath. A tall, thin butler with slicked-back silver hair bowed his head and invited us in. The room inside made me stop short. Vaulted ceilings, A crystal chandelier that didn't blaze but cast a soft golden glow over a long polished wooden table stretching to the far end of the room, lined on either side with black velvet chairs. And at the head, where the patriarch should be, sat a single man. I recognized him before I even saw his face. The gray cashmere scarf, now draped neatly over the shoulder of a dark wool coat, looked impossibly soft amid the cold grandeur of that space. I froze. My feet wouldn't move. He looked up, his eyes, the same ones I'd seen hours earlier when he sat shivering on a park bench, held the same gaze, wise, quiet, and without judgment. But this time, behind the simplicity, there was power. And a smile, genuinely warm. "Asher," he said first, voice deep and clear, not loud but resonating like a natural command. "Thank you for coming." Asher bowed slightly, nearly mumbling, "Yes, sir." Then he turned to me, smile unchanged. "And you must be Mave," he said slowly, like confirming something he'd known all along. "Welcome to the family." I stood frozen, still trying to process what was happening, but a small voice in my head whispered, "He knows. He remembers." And it was him on that bench, no one else. Arthur Elliott placed the scarf down on the table, folded it neatly, then gestured to the seat to his right. The seat of honor. The place reserved for either a guest of great value or someone he intended to protect. "Please," he said, "sit beside me." I moved forward slowly, past the long row of empty chairs, each footstep on the wood floor thudding in time with my heartbeat. As I passed Asher, I could feel his eyes on me, stiff and frozen. He stood there, shoulders taut like wire, saying nothing. But Arthur kept looking at me, unmoving. I pulled out the chair and sat down. No one else had been invited to sit. Arthur placed his hand lightly on the table, then turned to look at Asher. "I thought you made it clear to Mave what tonight was," he said, not angry but layered with implication. "I did," Asher replied quickly. "I told her. This was a meeting for you to better understand her." "No," Arthur cut in. "This is a night for me to see whether anyone in the Elliott family still recognizes a real human being, when they're not wearing a label, don't carry a legacy name, and aren't introduced by a flawless resume." He gently pushed the scarf toward me. "Do you know what made me remember you, Mave? Not because you stopped, but because you didn't hesitate to look at me as a person." I bit my lip, holding back emotion. The room was so silent I could hear every breath. "You didn't know who I was, you had no reason to stop. But you shared your last lunch, and the only scarf warm enough to matter. Not for status, not for optics, not to score points with anyone. And that's why I wanted you here." Asher lowered his eyes, hands tightening at his midsection. A butler quietly motioned for him to take a seat, but not near the head of the table. The chair was at the far end. Asher hesitated, then stepped down, and sat in the most distant spot, completely out of the room's central light. Arthur leaned slightly, his voice low but clear enough for the whole table to hear. "My son thought you were late because you were irresponsible, but I saw you were late because you couldn't walk past someone who was cold and hungry. That's the difference between someone who knows value and someone who only knows price." "I didn't think what I did would lead to this," I said softly. Arthur smiled. "Small acts," he said, "are usually what make the biggest difference. It took me nearly 70 years to learn that." No one in the room said a word. And I didn't need any more proof to know that at this very dining table, among people who believed they knew every rule of power, something had genuinely shifted. The silver fork in my hand trembled slightly, making the faintest clink against the porcelain plate. Even though the table was set like a classic formal banquet, red wine, rosemary, roasted lamb, candlelight dancing on crystal glass, no one touched the food. Arthur Elliott sat upright at the head of the table, hands resting on the folded napkin in his lap. He'd been silent for 10 minutes after instructing the staff to clear the appetizers, and when he finally spoke, he didn't look at me. He didn't look at Asher either. His eyes were focused on a point far ahead, as if speaking to someone not present. "Mave," he began, voice low and emotionless, Do you know why I withdrew from the financial world back in 2005? I had read a few articles suggesting he retired early, transitioned to a consulting role, or chose a quieter life for health reasons. But none of them clearly explained the complete disappearance of a man once dubbed the power brain behind 7 of America's largest investment funds. Arthur stayed quiet for a long moment, then spoke again, softly, like recounting an old story long buried. Because Asher's mother died, and I never believed it was an accident. Asher's head shot up, his eyes froze, his lips parted as if to ask something, but closed again as Arthur raised a hand to stop him. The papers said she slipped in the guest house bathroom up in the mountains. No one else was there, no cameras. The only housekeeper scheduled that day had called in sick. He stared into the candle in front of him. I used to believe it. I tried to believe she was just unlucky. 3 months ago, he continued, his voice slower, sharper than before, I received a small wooden box via internal courier. No return address, no signature. Inside was a handwritten letter. My wife's handwriting. Unmistakable. The letter was dated the day before she died. This time, he looked straight at me. In the letter, she said she didn't feel safe, that someone was tampering with her medication, that if anything happened to her, I should not assume it was an accident. I swallowed hard. Asher lowered his head into his hand and rubbed his forehead slowly. Along with the letter, Arthur said, now raspier, was a copy of a chemical test report from a private lab. It showed an unusual level of a compound not approved in her prescription, a toxic alkaloid known to disrupt the nervous system and affect blood pressure. The room was so still I could hear the glassware tremble slightly in the breeze from the fireplace. The problem is, he said, the only person regularly present in that home aside from family was someone who wasn't yet a daughter-in-law, but was always by my eldest son's side. Elena Barron. I had heard the name. Elena. Nathan's ex-wife now, the executive vice president of the Elliott Group, and according to Asher, if Dad ever dies, she'll be the one in charge. Arthur gave a slight nod, as if reading my thoughts. Elena was the only one who didn't attend the funeral, didn't send condolences, didn't return to that house after their mother died, he said, looking at Asher, his expression unchanged. And she's the only one in recent years who's tried to keep me off the board, citing health and age as her reasoning. Are you sure? Asher asked quietly, breaking the silence for the first time. Couldn't it have been someone else, an old staff member, a medical error? Arthur shook his head. I'm not declaring her guilty. But if you're asking whether I trust her, the answer is no, I never have. And your mother's letter left me no choice but to dig into everything. He leaned back in his chair as if finally letting go of a heavy burden he'd carried too long. And do you know the irony, Mave? He said, turning to me, eyes softening. The first person to ask who was there that day wasn't a lawyer, wasn't family. It was a girl who stopped in a snowstorm, handed me a scarf, a meal, and a look that didn't flinch. From the moment I stepped into this room, I had no longer been an outsider. And what was unfolding here was not simply a dinner. This was the beginning of a new chapter in a family story no one had ever told. Asher shoved his chair back and stood abruptly as Arthur Elliott finished his sentence. The metal legs scraping across the stone floor echoed dryly through the space still thick with the weight of the previous revelation. You can't be serious, Asher said, voice low but tight as a wire. You're giving control of the trust to Mave? She's not even family. She doesn't know anything about our system. I turned to look at him, not shocked but still chilled. Not because he objected, but because of that look. The same anxious expression he'd once shown when telling me he always felt like a stranger in his own home was now aimed at me, like I was the threat. She's the only one in this room without an agenda, Arthur answered, unmoved. And the only one who doesn't need Elliott to validate her worth. Asher let out a dry laugh. So, you're choosing her over a sandwich? A scarf? Or is this just you teaching your son a moral lesson before dessert? I placed my hand on the table and slowly stood up. Don't do this, Asher. Don't you see, he said. My entire life, I've been tested, scored, compared to standards no one could ever meet, and now, one impulsive act, one show of feeling, and suddenly you're the worthy one? You think that's fair? If I was chosen because of that act, then no, it wouldn't be fair. But maybe I was chosen not because of the scarf, but because I wasn't afraid to be fully seen? I turned to face Arthur, in every eye watching us. I know you had a reason for this decision, I said, and I know the fact that I'm not an Elliot makes it sensitive. But if the role you're giving me is to symbolize dignity and ethics, then I have to be clear about one thing. I'm not a banner for someone to wave because it's convenient. I'm not a certificate of virtue to hang up for show. If I do something, I do it because it's right, not because it's popular. The room fell completely silent. One of the elder lawyers near the window gave a light cough, then said nothing else. I could see Arthur's eyes narrow slightly, as if weighing something else. Then he reached behind the chair and opened a nearly invisible compartment. From the compartment he pulled out an old envelope sealed with faded red wax. There's something you need to know, he said, this time addressing Asher. The current will wasn't the only one. Your mother once wrote her own, by hand, without going through the family attorney. Arthur handed the envelope to me. My hands trembled slightly as I took it. The paper was thick, stiff, carrying the faint, sharp scent of old documents kept in sealed cabinets. On the front, in delicate handwriting, were 4 words. For when they forget. You want me to open it? Not want, he replied. I believe if anyone can understand what she left behind, it's you. I used the silver letter opener nearby to carefully slice through the edge. Inside was a handwritten document on pale yellow paper, the penmanship elegant and consistent to the last letter. A formal will, dated roughly 10 days before her death. Among the loving notes to her 2 sons there was one passage that caught my breath. I leave the right to appoint a moral guardian of the Elliott Education and Culture Fund to anyone not bearing the Elliott name, but who holds faith in the value of people, not possessions, because if anyone can keep the light in this family alive, it won't be the heir but the one brave enough not to need an inheritance at all. I folded the paper and returned it to the envelope. She saw what I once missed. And now, I choose to act on that wish. I looked over at Asher. He was quietly sinking back into his chair, his gaze drifting somewhere between the feeling of being stripped and a deeper, hollow emptiness. I left the Elliott estate a little after 11 p.m. The snow hadn't started yet, but the wind was cutting cold, the kind of cold that wakes you up, as if the air itself is forcing you to be honest with yourself. Asher didn't walk me out. He stayed inside, still sitting at the far end of the table, his shoulders hunched like the entire weight of that evening had landed on his back. I didn't know what I had hoped for after handing Arthur the handwritten will, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay and play the part of a moral symbol for a system that didn't want change, only a fresh coat of paint. 3 days later I received a message from Asher. I'll understand if you don't want to hear anything from me, but if you're willing, I'd like to talk. Not as an Elliot, just as myself. The man who hurt you more than I ever admitted. I read it while sitting in the small living room of a temporary rental apartment in Burlington. Outside the window, the frozen lake reflected the muted light of the street lamps. I pressed and held the message, and left it there. The next day he showed up. He wore a light gray turtleneck sweater, standing at the door, bare hands in the freezing air. I know you don't owe me anything, he said when I opened the door, but if you could spare me 10 minutes, I won't ask for more. I stayed silent for a moment, then stepped aside holding the door open. The room had only one armchair and a low table. I gestured for him to sit. He didn't. He stood, hands clasped together. I thought, if I did everything right, picked the right scarf, the right words, the right timing, then it would all work out, he began. But I was wrong, and the thing I feared most wasn't being disowned by my father, it was being seen by you. Not the version I tried to build, but the real me. The scared, messy, stunted version. Nothing in his words made me angry, it was just too late for them to carry the same weight. I don't blame you for not coming back to the table that night, Asher continued. I know, a year ago, the old you might have stayed, comforted me, helped me, find direction, but the woman you are now doesn't need to carry other people's growth anymore. I turned my face away, my eyes drifting toward the corner of the table, where I had placed a copy of his mother's handwritten will. Under the yellow light, the writing was still crisp, like a whisper from a woman who had once understood the world she lived in and chose to rewrite its rules before it devoured her son. I want to come back, Asher said quietly. Not to keep you with me, but to start over. From the beginning, with no one propping me up. I walked over and handed him the coat hanging behind the chair. He took it, his hand brushing mine. Warm enough to feel, but not enough to hold. I'm not angry, I said. And I don't hate you. But I also don't want to be the person who helps you change anymore. He turned, walked to the door, then paused. He didn't look back. But before stepping over the threshold, he said softly, "Thank you for no longer saving me from myself." When the door closed behind him, I didn't feel empty. I felt peaceful. A kind of peace I had never felt so clearly before. Not because I had won, but because for the first time, I no longer needed to prove I deserved to stay. 6 months after that night, I hung a small sign on the glass window of a 2-story red brick house tucked in a quiet Montpelier neighborhood. Harper Legal Resource Center, for justice without privilege. There was no grand opening, no speech, just a quiet autumn morning, a pot of coffee I brewed myself, an open window, and the first file on my desk. A 35-year-old woman seeking custody of her child after being thrown out by her husband, a trust fund investor because she reported domestic abuse. Her story wasn't mine, but the way she described the numbness of being trapped between wealth, reputation, and isolation felt achingly familiar. I didn't start this center out of gratitude, and I didn't do it to get back at anyone. I did it because I know what it feels like to be caught between two worlds. On one side the values you believe in, and on the other the powers you're not allowed to question. I walked through that dark space without a map, and I don't want anyone else to have to navigate it in silence the way I once did. My team was only 4 people. Me, a retired family lawyer named Grace Mitchell, a third-year law student with endlessly curious eyes, and a woman who used to be our very first client, now our intake coordinator. We didn't have big salaries or legal backing from major firms, only early morning meetings in a cramped kitchen, whiteboards covered in scribbled timelines, and late nights writing statements for clients who didn't even know how to write an email. About a week after the center opened, I received a package by express delivery, no name on the return label, a familiar handwritten address, Fairchild Ridge, Vermont. I opened it. Inside was a small cedar wood box lined with chestnut-colored velvet. It didn't hold papers or money. It held a gray cashmere scarf, the one I'd taken off my neck to give to a homeless man on the night everything changed. The scarf was the same, soft, warm, slightly faded at the fold, but carefully refolded, with a handwritten note placed on top. "Mave, you turned the course of a dynasty with a sandwich and true kindness." No Elliot name, no title, only you. Thank you for not walking past me on that bench. Author? I read it over and over, long enough for my coffee to go cold, my hand still resting on the paper, not because the words were emotional, but because the quiet recognition within them was worth more than any fortune I'd ever seen the Elliots fight over. From that day on, a small financial grant began appearing regularly in the center's operations account, through an anonymous fund called June Fund. I knew exactly who was behind it, but Arthur never called, never emailed. He let me do it my way, and that was the most generous gift he ever gave. One late afternoon in October, I stepped out of the consultation room after 3 tense hours with the client, terrified of losing custody to her wealthy ex-husband's family. She hugged me in the hallway, crying, and said, "For the first time in my life, someone stood by me without asking for a credit card." I smiled, because I understood. Sometimes, what people need most isn't to be rescued. It's a place calm enough for them to stand on their own. No pressure, no pity, no need to deserve it. The old currency, empty praise, strategic handshakes, promises wrapped in gold, no longer fits the stories I now live with every day. I was once chosen to enter the Elliot household, but now I choose my own path. And I know I don't need to stay somewhere just to prove I'm enough. The stage lights weren't as harsh as I expected. They were soft, enough to see the faint rows of the audience below, but still keeping me separate, like a storyteller on the edge of light and shadow. I wore a simple navy mule suit. No jewelry, no slide deck, just me, a wireless mic clipped to my collar, and 18 minutes to speak about something I once thought would remain a private wound forever. The auditorium was eerily quiet. Like all outside noise had been cut off the moment I stepped on stage. I used to think, I began, that the biggest test in life was getting other people to love you, to choose you, to believe you were worthy of standing beside them. I paused. In the third row, I caught the gaze of an older woman clutching the hand of someone next to her. She simply looked at me, like she already knew what I was about to say. But then I realized, I continued, the real test is how not to lose yourself in the process. I recounted it, all of it, clearly, without dramatizing. The winter night, the dinner I thought was an introduction to my partner's family, but was actually a quiet vetting, a cashmere scarf that changed the course of fate, and an empty seat at the end of a table, where people placed those they considered less than. I didn't list names. I never said Elliot or Arthur or even Asher. I didn't have to. I talked about the system, the one that demands your best-looking self polished with credentials, networks, and success metrics, a system that only recognizes you if you're certified by the standards it invented. I came close to being certified, I said, and in that moment I felt so small, like I was a reflection of expectations other people had projected onto me. I told the story of the night I rose from that mansion dining room, not in protest, but in quiet departure, of the feeling that was light, painful, and real, of choosing a path where no carpet was laid, but at least I could walk it with my own feet. The audience stayed silent the entire talk. No murmurs, no phone screens lighting up, just real listening, the kind I used to think was a luxury in boardrooms, where everyone only waited for their turn to speak. All day I closed. I received a small box. Inside was the scarf I had once handed to a stranger on a bench in winter, along with a note that said, "You turn the course of a dynasty, with a sandwich and true kindness." I don't think I turned anything, I only stopped and saw a human being without needing to ask if he was worth it. I walked off the stage in silence, no outro music, no spotlight trailing behind. But as I stepped down the small staircase toward the wings, I caught a glimpse, far left of the auditorium, of an elderly man sitting still, head bowed slightly, hands folded near his mouth. Arthur Elliot. The stage lights made his hair shimmer silver like snow. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit but a simple turtleneck sweater, with a gray scarf, the same one, wrapped around his neck. That scarf, once again, present like a symbol that didn't need to be named. I stood there, at a distance, and watched him slowly raise a hand, wiping something from the corner of his eye, then lean gently back into his seat, as if releasing a burden carried for years. For the first time, perhaps in his entire life, someone from the Elliot family had stepped into the public eye, without needing the Elliot name to be heard. What do you think of the choice I made? Of walking away, not out of failure, but because I no longer wanted to be accepted on someone else's terms. Maybe all of us at some point have stood before a table like that where we're asked to choose between keeping the truest part of ourselves or trading it for the right to stay seated. If you've ever felt that, I hope you'll share your story in the comments below. Maybe your voice is exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if you'd like to keep following these heartfelt journeys about family choices and human worth amid the unchangeable, hit follow so you don't miss the stories to come.